My daughter abandoned her two children at my house one Friday evening and never came back. So I petitioned the court for custody and made sure she could never take them from me again. It didn't happen all at once. No act of cruelty in real life ever does. There was no one moment where I could say, this is the day she stopped being their mother. But looking back, I can see now that the unraveling had started long before that Friday. Long before the bags were dropped by the door. Long before the phone calls stopped. Long before the two little faces looked up at me with questions too big for their years. It started in smaller ways, in missed birthdays, in rushed visits, in excuses that changed form but never content. I told myself she was tired, that she was struggling, that life had been unfair to her and she just needed time. But time became distance, and distance became absence. And then came silence. My daughter, Rachel, had once been everything I hoped for in a child. Sharp, witty, fiercely independent. She was my only one, and I raised her alone after her father died in a car accident when she was just 6. I poured everything I had into her. Time, energy, sacrifices that I made so easily because she was my world. I worked nights for years so I could attend her school events in the afternoon. I gave up opportunities, social circles, even relationships. And she grew up strong, but not kind. That was the thing I missed. When Rachel had her first child at 23, I was overjoyed. He was a soft, quiet baby, with wide brown eyes and the same dimple on his left cheek that his grandfather had. 2 years later came his sister, louder, brighter, a little whirlwind of laughter and tantrums. They were my joy, my second chance at purpose. I looked at them and felt, for the first time in a long while, that life had looped back towards something good. But Rachel wasn't built for motherhood. At first, it was the postpartum blues, then the long depressive silences. Then came the men, one after another, none staying long, none worth the disruption they brought. I tried not to judge. I knew she was overwhelmed, lonely. But over time, her presence in her children's lives became something I could only describe as performative. She would show up late, leave early, forget essentials. She'd bring them to me for the weekend, then disappear for 4 or 5 days without checking in. When I asked where she'd been, she always had a breathless excuse. A job interview, a migraine, a flat tire. But her eyes never matched her words. The kids began to notice. One afternoon, the older one, Sam, looked up from his cereal and said, "Is Mummy coming back this time?" I froze. "Of course she is," I said, though even as the words left my mouth, I tasted their hollowness. He nodded slowly, as if the lie comforted him enough for the moment. I started keeping a journal. Not because I was building a case, not then, but because I needed somewhere to place the hurt, the confusion, the guilt that clawed at me late at night when the house was dark and I was the only adult left awake, watching over 2 children who were no longer guests in my home, but occupants. I wrote down everything. What time she dropped them off, how long she stayed, what she promised, and what she failed to do. I began to photograph their meals, their homework, their laundry, their smiles, documenting the shape of their days as a way of convincing myself I hadn't imagined how absent she'd become. Still, I waited. I didn't want to be the one who gave up on her. I didn't want to cross that invisible line between grandmother and mother, even though, by every measure except biology, I had already done so. But then came the night I found her daughter, little Ava, curled up on the bathroom floor, her tiny arms wrapped around her knees, whispering through tears. I was too loud. Mommy said I ruin everything. I stood in that doorway and felt something inside me shift, not crack, not break, shift, something dormant and deep, something that had always been there but had waited until this moment to rise. After I got Ava into bed, I poured myself a glass of wine I didn't want and sat at the kitchen table in silence. I didn't cry. I didn't rage. I didn't call Rachel. I just stared at the calendar, at the tiny scribbles I'd made to track her arrivals and departures, and realized I could no longer pretend this was temporary. This wasn't a rough patch. This was a pattern, a decision she was making again and again. To leave, to fail, to fade from their lives and expect someone else to pick up the pieces. The next morning, I called an attorney. His name was Nathan. He was calm, deliberate, kind without being sentimental. I told him everything. He didn't blink when I mentioned I had already been their primary caregiver for over a year. He didn't sound surprised when I said Rachel hadn't attended a single school conference, hadn't taken them to a doctor's appointment, hadn't even paid for their shoes. What he said was, "You've already been raising them. Now we just make it legal." The paperwork was overwhelming at first. Forms and statements and notarized letters. I gathered every photo, every medical record, every email thread. I copied the journal. I even retrieved screenshots from our old text messages. The ones where she made vague promises. The ones where I asked, "Where are you?" and never got an answer. I didn't tell Rachel. Not yet. I wanted the foundation to be solid first. I knew the storm would come. But I wasn't afraid of it. I was ready. Because someone had to choose those children. And it wasn't going to be her. I didn't realize how deeply Rachel's absence had woven itself into the fabric of our days until I started preparing to formalize what had already become true in practice. That I was, for all intents and purposes, the children's mother now. The rhythm of our household had adjusted itself around her long ago. Sam's lunch was packed the way he liked it. No cheese, no green things. One cookie always tucked into the napkin. Ava's hair was braided tight before school because she said it made her feel strong and smart. And I always added a pink clip to make her smile in the mirror. Bedtime was my voice reading the same story twice because Ava said she never really heard it the first time. It was my signature on the permission slips, my hands doing the laundry, my name whispered during nightmares. And all the while, Rachel had become a kind of ghost, referenced in drawings, missed in theory, but rarely expected in practice. When she did appear, she brought noise, promises, and plastic bags of junk food, staying just long enough to unsettle everyone before leaving again under some vague pretense, like a shift at work or a sudden migraine. Nathan, the attorney, had a way of asking questions that made it clear he already knew the answers. He asked for documentation, and I handed over folders I had quietly filled for over a year. He didn't blink when he saw the pages of text messages, the time-stamped journal entries, the school records listing me as the primary contact. He skimmed through them with a practiced eye, then looked up and said, "This will hold." I nodded, but something in me flinched. I hadn't come into this to win a case. I'd come into it because I couldn't keep living in the uncertainty, couldn't keep watching those children hold their breath every time the doorbell rang, wondering if this was the time she came back and stayed. I couldn't keep explaining her silence with softness, and I couldn't keep pretending she was something she had clearly chosen not to be. I began to notice the little ways in which the children had adjusted to this new reality. Sam no longer asked when Rachel was coming. He stopped drawing her into family portraits. Ava, once so desperate for her mother's approval, had started clinging to me in new ways, not just with affection, but with expectation. She would glance up at me in the grocery store as if to make sure I was still there, even when I'd only turned down another aisle. Rachel, meanwhile, continued to hover on the periphery, checking in sporadically, always with a thin layer of explanation that never addressed the core truth. One Saturday morning, she called just as I was tying Ava's shoes by the front door. "Hey, I was thinking maybe I could take them to the park later," she said, her voice too bright, too rushed. "You know, just for an hour or two. Nothing big." I hesitated. "Where would you take them?" "Just around," she said. "That place with the swings, the one off Maple." "You mean the one you left them at last March without telling me?" She went quiet. "I was 15 minutes away," she muttered. "You didn't call. You didn't even leave a note." There was a beat of silence on the line. Then, "Why are you always trying to make me feel like a bad mother?" I didn't answer, because the question itself was deflection. I wasn't trying to make her feel anything. I was watching her choices speak louder than any words. "I'll let you know," I said finally, and hung up. Nathan encouraged me to request a temporary guardianship order as the first legal step. It was a way to formalize my role while the full custody petition moved through the courts. It wasn't permanent yet, but it would mean that I could make all necessary decisions for the children, medical, educational, even relocation, without Rachel's consent. I signed the forms with hands that were steadier than I expected. When I told the kids, I kept it simple. "Some people are going to ask me to prove that I'm the one who takes care of you." And I said, "Of course I will. I love them, and they're safe with me." Sam nodded. "Well, duh." Ava asked if it meant we were moving. "No, honey," I said, smoothing her hair. "It means no one can make us move." Rachel's response, when she found out, was a string of angry voicemails, none of which I answered. In the last one, she cried. I sat on the couch and listened to the whole thing once, then pressed delete. She didn't show up. She didn't file anything. She didn't even call Nathan's office to object. Because deep down, I think, she knew. She wasn't losing them. She had already let them go, and I, steady, quiet, relentless, had simply refused to let them fall. The first time someone questioned what I was doing, really questioned it, was at the pediatrician's office. It had been a routine appointment for Ava, just a checkup and some paperwork for school, the kind of visit I'd handled a dozen times before. But that morning, as I was gathering her forms from the receptionist, the nurse, a new one I didn't recognize, glanced at the paperwork and asked, "So, are you mom or grandma today?" The question wasn't malicious. It was casual, even friendly, a small talk kind of thing. But something in the phrasing hit me unexpectedly. I froze for half a breath before responding, "I'm both, I suppose." She laughed politely and nodded, but I could tell she didn't understand. How could she? She hadn't seen Ava sit silent for 3 hours on the floor after Rachel's last broken promise. She hadn't watched Sam throw his backpack against the wall because he didn't know how to say, "I miss her, but I'm scared she'll come back and leave again." The nurse only saw a smiling child with bright hair and a well-packed lunchbox. She didn't see the nights, the questions, the quiet damage. Later that day, I told Nathan about it, not because it mattered legally, but because it shook something loose in me. He listened without interruption, then said, "It's natural. You're moving between identities, from grandmother to mother, and the world doesn't always know what to do with that." "I didn't know what to do with it either," I admitted. "You did what the children needed," he replied. "Everything else catches up." But not everyone agreed. My sister, June, called one evening from across the country. We hadn't spoken much since Rachel started pulling away, partly because June had always been the kind of person who saw family as sacred and unassailable, no matter the reality. "I just worry you're overstepping," she said, her voice tightly controlled. She's their mother, Lillian. She's young. She's figuring it out. I looked out the window at that moment, watching Sam help Ava tie her shoelace on the porch. She's not figuring it out. She's vanishing, I said quietly. She's your daughter. She was their mother. There was a long silence on the line. I'm not doing this to punish her, I added. I'm doing this because the children stopped waiting for her, and someone had to stay. June didn't call again for a while. The court date for the temporary guardianship came faster than I expected. It was a simple hearing, procedural, but I dressed carefully that morning. Not out of vanity, but because I wanted to be seen clearly. I wore a navy jacket, sensible shoes, and carried the entire case file in a plain black folder, even though Nathan told me I wouldn't need to speak. Rachel didn't show. The judge, a middle-aged woman with a tired kindness in her eyes, reviewed the documents in silence. When she finally looked up, she said, "From everything I see here, these children have been in your care for an extended period, with no significant involvement from the biological mother. The petition is thorough and well supported. I see no reason not to grant temporary guardianship." I nodded once. I didn't smile. It wasn't victory. It was confirmation. Afterward, I sat alone in my car in the courthouse parking lot for several minutes, holding the signed order in my lap. The seal pressed through the paper, embossing the truth into something irreversible. I closed my eyes and let that settle. I hadn't taken anything from Rachel. I had simply protected what she had left behind. But that didn't mean it didn't ache. That week, Sam came home with a drawing he made in art class. It was a house, simple and square, with 4 stick figures standing out front. Him, Ava, me, and a 4th figure, crossed out in heavy crayon. "I didn't like how I drew her," he said, explaining the mark. "So I erased her. Is that okay?" I knelt beside him, trying to find the words that wouldn't shatter him or lie to him. "You can draw whatever helps you feel safe," I said. He nodded and ran off to wash his hands. I kept that picture. I didn't frame it, but I placed it in the drawer where I kept other things I didn't know what to do with. Rachel's old birthday cards to the kids, her first Mother's Day note to me, the ultrasound photo she once left in the glove box of her car and forgot to take back. I didn't throw any of it away, not out of hope, out of respect for what might have been, and never was. Life settled into a new kind of rhythm after that. The order changed everything and nothing at the same time. I had authority now, legal, formal, recognized, but the days looked much the same. I still made breakfast, still packed backpacks, still sat up with Ava when her growing pains made her cry in the night. But I no longer waited for Rachel, and the children didn't either. I had expected that once the paperwork was formalized and the guardianship legally acknowledged, the weight that had lived in my chest for so many months would finally begin to lift. Not all at once, but gradually, like dust settling after a long storm. And yet, what I found instead was that with legal recognition came a different kind of pressure, one that didn't stem from uncertainty or fear of loss, but from the knowledge that now I alone was responsible for ensuring the children's emotional survival. No one else was coming to share the burden, and no court stamp or notarized signature could ease the ache of knowing that 2 small hearts still pulsed with the unanswered question of why their mother had disappeared. The following Monday, I received a message from Rachel. It was not a phone call, nor a visit, nor even a voicemail where her voice might have given something away. It was a text, terse and unpunctuated, asking simply, "So, I guess this is what we're doing now?" I stared at the screen for longer than I meant to, rereading the line as though it might reveal a deeper meaning the second or third time through. But of course it didn't. There was no sorrow in it, no humility, no expression of regret or reflection. It was the voice of someone whose pride had been pricked, someone who believed that parenthood was a permanent entitlement rather than an ongoing act of presence and care. I didn't answer. I set the phone down and turned back to Ava, who was sitting at the kitchen table trying to spell her name backward because she said that's how astronauts wrote on the moon. I told her she was probably right and handed her another pencil when the eraser tore through the paper. But silence, I've learned, never stays unanswered for long. A week later, I found out from Nathan that Rachel had contacted a legal aid organization. Not a lawyer, not yet, but enough to signal that she might contest the guardianship. I didn't panic. I didn't cry. But a chill ran through me, not because I feared losing them, but because I knew what a courtroom could do to a child's sense of safety. Legal processes, for all their intended fairness, rarely move at the speed of a child's need for consistency. I imagined Sam being asked to choose, Ava being forced to speak in rooms full of strangers, and I felt something rise in me that I hadn't tasted in years, a kind of maternal ferocity that bypasses logic and moves straight to instinct. I would protect them, even from their own mother, if that's what the moment required. I sat with Nathan for 2 hours that week, preparing a formal response in case Rachel filed anything. He walked me through likely outcomes, the process for a home evaluation if it came to that, and how we would approach any attempt by Rachel to regain custody without demonstrating sustained involvement. He was cautious, but calm, and I leaned into that steadiness because I needed it to temper the quiet fury gathering just beneath the surface of my resolve. In the days that followed, I watched Rachel's behavior closely, not because I wanted to catch her in a mistake, but because I needed to understand what was real and what was still performance. She began showing up again, first once, then twice, always with exaggerated warmth and slightly off-timed enthusiasm, as if overcompensating for the months she had vanished. She brought colouring books, store-bought cookies, toys too young for their age, and she sat stiffly on the couch like a guest unsure of her welcome. The children didn't quite know what to do. Ava was polite, but tentative. Sam, now 9 and observant in ways he didn't even fully grasp, watched her like someone might watch a magician. Curious, unsure if the trick was meant to entertain or distract. "Do you think Mommy is staying this time?" Ava asked me after one of those visits, her voice small but direct. "I don't know what she'll do," I said, choosing my words with care. "But I do know that I'm not going anywhere." That, I hoped, was enough. Rachel never stayed longer than an hour. She rarely asked about their routines, their schoolwork, or their friends. She came bearing gifts, but left without insight. She spoke in memories, not in plans. And when I handed her a copy of the school schedule, something I did more out of obligation than optimism, she left it on the coffee table, untouched, when she left that afternoon. One morning, I received an envelope in the mail. No return address, but postmarked from the city where Rachel had last lived. Inside was a handwritten letter, uneven and emotionally erratic, veering between apology and accusation in the span of a single paragraph. She accused me of turning the children against her, of acting like I'd always been better, and ended by saying she hoped someday they'd understand what I had taken from her. I folded the letter carefully, placed it in the file where everything else lived, and made a note of its tone and timing. But I didn't respond. Instead, I took the children to the pumpkin patch that weekend. It was something we'd done every year, even before Rachel's disappearance, and I had debated skipping it this time, fearing the weight of tradition might feel too heavy. But they needed continuity, and so did I. We walked the rows, picked out our pumpkins, drank cider too sweet for my taste, and laughed at the way Ava managed to get mud on both knees before we even reached the field. In those hours, I felt something soften, not the grief, not the anger, but the edge of loneliness that had lingered for too long, even in the presence of joy. That night, after they were asleep, I sat by the fire with a blanket over my legs and reread the initial guardianship order. I didn't need to. There was nothing new in it. But I wanted to remember what had begun this, what had grounded it all. Not vengeance, not pride, not punishment. Only love, only protection, only the silent promise I made to myself the day Rachel left without saying goodbye. No matter what she does next, I thought, I will not abandon them to her absence. I closed the folder, turned off the lamp, and went to bed, knowing, with a steadiness I had earned inch by inch, that this was no longer something temporary I was holding on to. This was home. The leaves had already begun to drop from the trees in long, lazy spirals by the time Rachel formally filed her petition for custody modification. It came on a Tuesday, folded neatly into a cream-coloured envelope, and hand-delivered by a young man who didn't make eye contact, who simply said my name, handed me the paper, and walked away with practiced speed. I closed the door behind me and held the envelope in both hands for a long moment before opening it. The paper inside was clean, official, and completely devoid of context. Just her name, the children's names, a case number, and the declaration that she wished to resume custody as the natural and legal mother of the minors in question. There was no mention of the months she'd been gone, no mention of the appointments missed, the birthdays unacknowledged, the way Sam had started to check the lock on the front door every night before bed. There were no footnotes acknowledging Ava's night terrors or the way I'd held her through fevers Rachel didn't know about. The petition treated the past year like it was an inconvenient gap in a resume, something to be glossed over, omitted, rewritten. Nathan responded quickly, drafting our objection with the quiet confidence I had come to trust. He was exact in tone, not aggressive, not accusatory, just firm, grounded, and methodical. We outlined the facts, the length of time the children had been in my care, the absence of any documented contribution or visitation, the existing guardianship order. We included copies of school reports, medical logs, photos, and my journal entries. Every line was a piece of evidence, not just in a case, but in a life I had lived with and for those children. But legal response was only half the battle. The other half, the part that came without courtrooms or filings, happened in the house each day, as I tried to hold our new normal steady while the potential for upheaval pressed against the walls like a draft through an old window. Sam grew quieter again, not moody, but cautious. He asked questions in hypothetical terms. What if we had to live somewhere else? Or, if someone else made rules, would we still do pizza on Fridays? Ava, more sensitive in her way, began clinging more tightly at bedtime, asking for an extra story, then a second drink of water, then just one more hug. I gave it all to her, without question. One night, after they were asleep, I sat in the living room with the lights low and the petition open in front of me. I reread Rachel's words over and over again, searching for a trace of understanding, of responsibility, of grief. But there was none. Her language was clinical, her tone legalistic. It wasn't the voice of a mother seeking reconciliation. It was the voice of someone asserting a right, of someone who had mistaken biology for effort, title for substance. The first court date was scheduled for late November, just before Thanksgiving, and it felt both impossibly far away and dangerously close. I moved through the days with practiced calm, waking before the children, preparing their breakfasts, getting them to school, managing their routines with a precision that came not from fear, but from habit. I answered no questions from friends or neighbors, not because I wanted to hide, but because I had learned that explaining this kind of loss to outsiders only made the ache worse. There were those who meant well, who said things like, "I'm sure she'll come around," or "maybe this is just her way of waking up." But they hadn't seen the drawing Sam left on the fridge that week, a picture of a house with one adult and two children, labelled us. They hadn't watched Ava cut her sandwich into 4 pieces because Mommy used to make it messy and Grandma makes it nice. I held on to those things, small truths drawn in crayon and spoken with peanut butter on their breath, because they were the real testimony, the kind that no courtroom would ever record, but that lived etched inside me, clear and immutable. Rachel didn't call during that time. She didn't visit, didn't ask about school, didn't check on whether the children were sick or well. She filed a document and then vanished again, waiting, I assumed, for the system to move in her favor. It didn't. Not yet. When the court date finally came, I dressed the same way I had before. Simple, quiet, present. The children stayed home with a neighbor I trusted, and I sat beside Nathan in the courtroom as the judge, a different one this time, a younger man, sharper in tone, read over the filings. Rachel appeared 15 minutes late, hair pulled into a knot, wearing heels too high for the weather, and a coat that didn't quite close. She didn't look at me. When called to speak, she stood and read from a page she'd clearly written the night before. She said she loved her children, that she wanted to be a better mother, that she had made mistakes, but that those mistakes didn't define her. She didn't cry, but she tried to. She faltered halfway through a sentence about rebuilding trust and looked up to see if anyone believed her. I didn't. Nathan responded with facts, dates, records. He didn't disparage her. He didn't need to. Her own absence did the work for us. The judge requested a review by Family Services, an in-home assessment, and a third-party guardian ad litem to speak with the children. I expected this. I welcomed it. The more people who entered our home, the more they would see. Not perfection, not a performance, but stability, presence, love. The quiet kind. The kind that filled a lunchbox and showed up on time. After the hearing, Rachel passed me in the hallway without saying anything. Her eyes brushed mine, but there was nothing behind them I recognized. I felt a pang, not of doubt, not of regret, but of something quieter and more difficult to name. A kind of mourning for the girl she had once been, the child I had raised, the young woman I had once trusted to carry life forward in her own hands. But I knew better than to let that stop me now. I walked out into the cold, breathed the sharp air into my lungs, and returned home to the only thing that still made sense. 2 children, 1 front door, and a house where every light was still on. The woman from Family Services arrived on a Thursday afternoon, wearing a sensible jacket and carrying a leather portfolio tucked against her side like a shield. Her name was Miss Harding, efficient, polite, the sort of person who shook your hand firmly and made you feel, at least in theory, that the process would be fair. She introduced herself to the children in the living room with a warmth that struck me as practiced but genuine, kneeling down to their eye level, asking about school and Halloween costumes, complimenting Ava's colouring pages and Sam's model airplane kit. I stood nearby, not interfering, but present, anchoring the space the way I had learned to do, quietly, completely. She asked to see their rooms. She walked through the kitchen, noted the child locks on the medicine cabinet, asked about bedtimes and meals and routines. I had printed copies of the children's school records, immunization charts, and a calendar outlining their typical week. She accepted everything with a nod, flipping through the documents quickly, making brief notes with a thin silver pen. She asked questions in a tone that never suggested suspicion, only procedure. But I understood what she was really measuring: consistency, emotional safety, signs of attachment. At one point, she asked if the children had regular contact with their biological mother. Not regular, I said. Occasional, though less lately. Have they expressed a desire to see her more often? I paused before answering. They've expressed confusion, I said carefully. They're still sorting out what they've experienced. I answer their questions honestly, and I never speak against her in front of them. But they know who's here, and they know who isn't. She wrote something down, but didn't comment. She thanked me, said she'd be in touch, and left with a small, unreadable smile. Later that evening, after dinner and bath time and stories, Sam asked, "Is that lady going to decide if we stay here?" I looked him in the eye and said, "That lady is going to help make sure everyone who says they care about you is really doing what's best." "But we're already doing what's best," he said, his voice quiet but sure. I kissed the top of his head, told him I agreed, and turned off the light. In the days that followed, Rachel's contact increased. Short, nervous calls asking to see the children, requests sent through Nathan's office to rebuild consistency, as her petition now phrased it. But the pattern was the same. She made plans and didn't follow through. She arrived late or not at all. She brought toys and left with apologies. Ava began asking if Mommy's clock was broken. Sam stopped asking anything at all. One Sunday, Rachel came by without warning. It was late afternoon. The children were still in their pajamas, and the sky was low with winter light. She knocked and waited, her arms full of plastic shopping bags, her eyes darting between the windows like she wasn't sure what version of herself she'd brought this time. I opened the door, but didn't step aside. "I brought some things for them," she said, holding out the bags as if they were proof of devotion. Clothes, snacks, books. I looked down at the wrinkled plastic and then back at her. They have clothes, they have food, and the books they read are the ones we choose together. She flinched, just slightly. "I'm trying, okay?" "I know," I said, and something in my voice must have told her that trying, at this point, no longer meant what it used to. "I'm still their mother," she said, not angrily, but like someone asserting a fact that had stopped meaning something and needed to be said aloud to exist. "You are," I said, "but I'm the one raising them." She didn't answer that. She handed me the bags, stood there as if she wanted to ask to come in, then turned and walked back to her car without another word. Inside, the children didn't even come to the door. That night, I sat with Nathan on the phone and reviewed the visit. He made notes, added it to the case file, and confirmed that the guardian ad litem would be meeting with the children one-on-one the following week. I thanked him, hung up, and walked through the house with slow steps, turning off lights, closing cabinets, checking locks, not because I felt unsafe, but because the act itself had become a kind of ritual, a daily way of reminding myself that this home was still ours and still whole. And through it all, the children remained the center. Their laughter still echoed down the hallway in the mornings. Their questions still filled the car ride to school. Their drawings still covered the refrigerator. Their shoes still ended up in strange corners of the house. Their dreams still interrupted the nights with small footsteps and whispered requests for comfort. Rachel was still circling, still uncertain whether she wanted to reclaim or retreat. But I was no longer circling anything. I had built the center, and we were standing in it. The visit from the guardian ad litem took place on a pale, overcast morning in December, the kind of day where the sky seemed undecided and the wind moved without commitment. I had prepared the house not to impress, but to reflect how we lived. Blankets folded neatly over the backs of chairs, shoes in their tray by the door, the scent of oatmeal still lingering in the kitchen. Sam and Ava had been told only that someone was coming to talk to them, someone whose job it was to listen and understand what they needed. They didn't seem nervous. In fact, Sam seemed almost relieved to be able to speak to someone other than me or his teacher about the questions that had been quietly gathering behind his eyes. The guardian, Ms. Patel, was younger than I expected, with calm hands and a voice that moved slowly, as though she wanted each word to land gently. She greeted the children kindly, crouched down to their level, and asked them if they'd like to show her their favorite places in the house. I stayed in the kitchen while she followed them through the living room and up the stairs, listening to the soft cadence of their voices. Ava explaining how her dolls were arranged, and Sam showing her the poster on his wall with the phases of the moon. The sound of them being listened to, really listened to, brought a quiet ache to my chest. They deserved that. They had deserved it for a long time. When Ms. Patel returned to the kitchen alone, she sat at the table with a small notebook, thanked me again for the warm welcome, and asked me a series of questions that I knew came straight from protocol, about discipline, school support, routines, social adjustment. I answered without embellishment, simply and clearly, because I knew the facts didn't need help to speak for themselves. Finally, she asked, "And how would you describe your relationship with their mother at this point?" I paused, not because I didn't know the answer, but because I wanted to say it the way it needed to be said. "I would describe it as strained," I began. "There was love once, and there is still history, and I believe there is some part of her that still wants to believe she can be the parent they deserve. But there is a difference between wanting something and choosing it. She hasn't chosen to show up, and children need what's real, not what's promised." Ms. Patel wrote something down without reacting. When she left, the house felt both lighter and quieter, as if the weight of being observed had finally settled into memory. I went about the day as usual, keeping everything moving: school pickups, laundry, snacks, bath time. But my thoughts stayed close to the visit. I didn't know what Ms. Patel would write in her report. I didn't know what language she would use to describe what she had seen and heard, what judgment she might ultimately suggest. But I knew what she had witnessed: a home with structure, warmth, and presence. A place where the children belonged, not because someone had claimed them, but because someone had kept showing up. Rachel, meanwhile, grew quieter. She had not attended the last scheduled visit. She had not returned the follow-up call from Nathan. There were whispers, through unofficial channels, that she was struggling again, financially, emotionally, maybe more. I didn't take comfort in that. I didn't feel righteous or vindicated. I felt the deep, weary sadness of someone who had spent too many nights wondering where the line was between protecting your child and letting go of them. And then I reminded myself that I had not let go, not of Rachel, not exactly, but I had stepped back far enough to stop breaking myself open in the name of hope. One morning, as I was making breakfast, Ava sat at the table and asked me, in her small, clear voice, "Why doesn't Mommy stay when she comes?" I turned from the stove, wiped my hands on a dish towel, and sat beside her. "I think your mommy is still learning how to be the kind of grown-up who can stay in one place," I said gently. "Some people take longer to learn that." "Do you think she'll ever get good at it?" she asked. "I don't know," I replied. But I know you're getting really good at asking big questions. She smiled at that, and it was enough to move us forward. That evening, I pulled out the old photo album again, not to mourn, but to remember. I looked at pictures of Rachel as a child, her gap-toothed smile, her scraped knees, the birthday where she cried because she didn't want the pink bike. She wanted blue. I thought about how motherhood had surprised me, first when it came for the first time through her, and again when it returned uninvited, decades later, through her absence. And I realized that what I had been given wasn't just a second chance. It was a chance to redefine love entirely, not as a guarantee, not as a right, but as a daily act. So I closed the album, turned out the light, and let the house go still. Not empty, not broken, not waiting. Just full, just alive, just enough. The report from Miss Patel arrived in a manila envelope, sealed at the corners and stamped with the emblem of the court. I knew it was coming. But even so, when I saw it in the mailbox, my hands hesitated before reaching for it. It felt heavier than its size justified. Not because I expected it to surprise me, but because I understood what it represented. A distillation of our lives, our routine, our heartbreak, and our efforts, all reduced to a few formal pages of observation and recommendation. I opened it at the kitchen table after the children had gone to school, with the house quiet around me, only the soft hum of the refrigerator filling the silence. The report was thorough. Ms. Patel had documented her visit in neutral, professional language, but the truth came through clearly. The children were thriving in my care. They demonstrated emotional stability, age-appropriate independence, strong school performance, and a secure attachment to their current guardian. There was no evidence of neglect, inconsistency, or distress. Her recommendation, at the bottom of the final page, was plain but resolute. It is in the best interest of the minors that the current guardianship arrangement be maintained without disruption. I didn't cry. I didn't even smile. I folded the papers, placed them in the expanding case file I kept in the drawer beside the pantry, and poured myself a second cup of coffee. The validation was real, but the relief was not instant. I had long since stopped living in fear of being undone by the legal process. What lingered now was something deeper, something more complicated than fear. It was the knowledge that even with the truth laid bare, even with the children safe, there would always be a part of me mourning the failure of the bridge between my daughter and me. The next hearing was scheduled for January. In the weeks that followed, I watched Rachel become a ghost of herself. Not the angry, chaotic presence I had once dreaded, but a quieter, sadder echo of the girl she had been. She stopped showing up altogether. There were no more texts, no more half-hearted requests for visitation, no more promises that fell through. It was as if she had finally understood what had taken me months to accept. That parenting was not a performance, not a moment you stepped into when the timing felt right, but a commitment that asked something of you every day, especially when it was hard. One evening, Ava asked me if her mother was ever coming back. I took a long breath before answering. "I don't know if she'll come back the way you want her to," I said. "But I do know that you have a home, and you have people who love you, and you're not waiting on anyone to start living your life." Ava nodded solemnly, then said, "Okay," with a kind of gravity that didn't belong in a child so small. But there was peace in it too. The kind of peace that comes when a question stops being a wound and becomes a scar. That winter, we built something new. Not just a household, but a life that no longer looked back. I watched Sam grow into a boy who was quiet but steady, curious but grounded. I watched Ava become more certain in her voice, more confident in her step. We celebrated birthdays and holidays, not as people who had lost something, but as people who had built something despite the loss. We made new traditions, not because the old ones were gone, but because they no longer fit the shape of our days. One morning, I found a note on the kitchen counter, written in Sam's small, deliberate handwriting. It read, "Thank you for being the kind of mum who stays." I stood in the quiet of the kitchen, holding the note with both hands, and let the words settle inside me. Not as a reward, not even as recognition, but as a reminder of what I had become. Not in place of Rachel, not as her replacement, but as something else entirely, the person who had chosen to stay, every single day, without being asked, without applause, without question. By the time the next hearing came, the outcome was a formality. The judge reviewed the report, confirmed the continued absence of any objection from Rachel, and signed the order for permanent guardianship. No speech, no drama, just a nod, a scribble of a pen, and the soft thud of a folder being closed. When I came home that afternoon, I didn't tell the children right away. Not because I wanted to shield them, but because I wanted the moment to be ours, quiet and unremarkable, in the way that only deeply important things can be. That night, as I tucked them into bed, I simply said, "We belong together, and no one can change that now." Sam nodded. Ava smiled, and neither of them asked why, because they already knew. In the weeks after the final ruling, life didn't change in any visible way. The routines remained. The breakfast table still bore the same bowls and crumbs. The backpacks still leaned against the hallway wall each evening like little sentinels of childhood. And yet, something beneath the surface had undeniably shifted. There was a quietness in me now that hadn't existed before. Not the silence of exhaustion or defeat, but a steadiness that came from knowing that what I had built, slowly, stubbornly, through nights of doubt and mornings of resolve, was finally ours in a way that no court, no mother, no abandonment could undo. And Rachel disappeared entirely. I didn't hear from her again. Not a call, not a letter, not a message passed through some mutual acquaintance. It was as if the last thread that had loosely tied her to the children had finally unraveled, slipping quietly into the dark. I don't know where she went. I don't know who she became, or if she managed to become anyone at all. What I do know is that the absence of her presence no longer felt like a wound. It had become a simple fact, the way certain birds stop returning in winter. Not a betrayal, just a reordering of the natural world. There were nights, especially when the children had finally gone to sleep and the house dimmed into the hush of midnight, when I allowed myself to think about her. I would sit by the window with a cup of lukewarm tea and remember the girl she once was, all legs and sass and laughter that filled a room. I would think about her in the delivery room, trembling and pale, gripping my hand so tightly I lost circulation. I would remember how she cried the first time Sam had a fever, how she whispered lullabies that she made up on the spot, how fiercely she had once declared she would never leave her babies, no matter what. And then I would remember the long silences, the broken promises, the way Ava flinched when the doorbell rang, the way Sam stopped bringing home crafts on Mother's Day. That duality lived in me now, grief and relief sharing the same space, like two old tenants who no longer fought but had learned to pass each other quietly in the hall. The children began to blossom in ways I hadn't dared hope. Sam's teacher called to say he had volunteered to lead a group project, something he would never have done the year before. Ava began writing little books, stapled together stories with drawings and misspelled words, each one ending with a version of the same sentence. She stayed, and the kids were safe. One afternoon, while sorting through papers for a school fundraiser, I came across a family tree project Sam had completed. At the top was his name, then mine, and under my name, instead of grandmother, he had simply written, Mom, for real. I sat at the dining table with that page in my lap and let my hands tremble just slightly, not from sadness, not from doubt, but from the overwhelming honesty of it. Children, when left alone long enough to feel safe, speak the truth more cleanly than anyone else ever could. I never corrected him. I hung the paper on the side of the refrigerator. Spring arrived slowly that year, as though the earth itself had needed time to exhale. The trees in the backyard began to bud. Ava spent long afternoons creating chalk masterpieces on the driveway. Sam built a birdhouse with his scout troop and insisted we hang it outside the kitchen window, where I could see it every morning while I made coffee. Our home, once so strained by the ache of uncertainty, now echoed with something simpler. Laughter, small complaints about homework, the occasional tantrum over socks or sandwich crusts. There were still hard days, of course. No family, no matter how well defended by love, is immune to the sharp edges of life. But the difference now was that the hardship wasn't compounded by instability, wasn't deepened by the question of whether love alone would be enough to keep us whole. We were whole, not because everything had gone right, but because we had survived what had gone wrong and stayed. Toward the end of the school year, the principal invited guardians and parents to a special Family Day event. It was a small gathering, nothing elaborate, but each child had written a thank you letter to the adult they wanted to honor most. Sam handed me his in the school courtyard, cheeks flushed, eyes lowered in that way boys sometimes carry their feelings when they don't want them to seem too loud. I unfolded it slowly. It read, Dear Mom, thank you for staying when others didn't, for always making my lunch, for knowing when I'm lying and still letting me explain, for being the reason our house feels like a house and not just a place we sleep. I'm glad it's you. I looked up, but he was already gone, running back to his class with a small, embarrassed grin. I didn't chase after him. I just stood there for a long while, holding that letter against my chest, and realizing that I had never needed a title, not legally, not socially, not even from Rachel, because I had already become what the children needed most. And there is no greater truth than that. I had always assumed that closure would arrive like a door clicking shut, clean, unmistakable, final. But in truth, it came more like the slow dimming of a light that had long flickered in the corner of my vision. There was no announcement, no cathartic reckoning, no dramatic confrontation where wounds were confessed and healing began. Instead, there was only the slow realization that we had, somewhere along the way, stopped waiting for Rachel. Not out of bitterness or even grief, but because we had learned how to live without needing the shape of her shadow at the table. The day I received the final court letter, not just the guardianship confirmation, but the full transfer of legal custody, I was standing at the kitchen sink, rinsing a plate that still had a bit of syrup clinging to the edge from Ava's breakfast. The envelope was thick, and the return address from the county clerk's office was printed in dark, sharp ink. I opened it without ceremony, read the first sentence aloud to the silence around me, and then folded it, placed it on the counter, and went back to the dishes. That evening, after dinner, I told the children. I waited until we were all together in the den, the television humming softly in the background, Ava curled against my side, and Sam stretched out on the floor, drawing what looked like a spaceship with dragon wings. Today I got a letter from the court, I began. Sam didn't look up, but I saw the tension in his hand as it hovered over the paper. Marker paused mid-stroke. They said something that we already knew, I continued, that I'm your mother now, not just the person who takes care of you. Officially, legally, permanently. Ava blinked up at me, wide-eyed. You weren't already? I smiled. In every way that mattered, I always was. But now the papers match the truth. Sam didn't speak, not right away, but he put the marker down, turned his face slightly toward me and said, "Okay." That was all. But it was everything. In the months that followed, life unfolded not with drama, but with an ease I hadn't expected to earn. The legal steps faded into memory. The meetings stopped. The phone stayed silent. Rachel never called. Not for the children's birthdays, not for holidays, not when Ava lost her first tooth, or when Sam won his school's science award. At first, I waited. Then I stopped. And eventually, I forgot I had ever expected the phone to ring. One morning in early summer, I stood at the edge of the garden, watching Ava chase butterflies barefoot in the grass, while Sam read under the shade of the old oak tree. The breeze carried the scent of tomatoes and damp soil, and for a moment, just a single, quiet moment, I felt the full weight of what we had survived. It didn't arrive like triumph. It wasn't loud. It was a softness, a fullness in my chest that whispered, "You made it." Later that week, I took down the last of the old photographs, the ones from before, when Rachel still appeared in frames on the mantel or the hallway. I didn't do it with anger. There was no ritual, no resentment. I simply realized that the children didn't look at those pictures anymore. They had outgrown the ghosts. I placed the photos gently in a storage box and labeled it in small handwriting, "Before." I slid it into the back of the linen closet, beside the albums from their baby years, beside the folded baby clothes and the hospital bracelets I couldn't bear to throw away. Not because I needed them, but because part of loving a child is honoring even the chapters that didn't end well. I didn't look back when I closed the closet door. I didn't need to. One night in late July, after the children had gone to bed and the house had gone still, I stepped outside onto the porch. The sky was clear, and the stars blinked in a way that made the world feel both impossibly vast and suddenly close. I thought of Rachel, not the mother she had failed to be, but the girl I had once raised, the one who wore mismatched socks and painted her fingernails with glitter, who called me Mama even when she was 16, who once fell asleep in the back seat with a crayon stuck behind her ear. I let myself miss her. Not the ache of betrayal, but the memory of possibility. But then I thought of Ava's hand in mine that morning at the grocery store. I thought of Sam's quiet, careful smile when he got an answer right in math class and pretended not to care. I thought of their drawings, their notes, their voices calling for me from across the house. And I knew, with a steadiness that needed no witness, that I had not failed. I had stepped in. I had stood firm. I had stayed. And in staying, I had become something more than mother, more than guardian, more than savior. I had become home.